All right, so welcome back to another edition of the Modjeska Simkins School Deeper Dive. This is our third deeper dive of this Modjeska Simkins semester. And today we have a very special guest, Fergus Bordewich, who has been a friend of the school before. He spoke, of course, last year as well. And he is back to talk about a wide variety of topics that, of course, revolve around South Carolina's distinguishing role in U.S. history. And of course, as you know, distinguishing is not always a good thing, but it is an important thing. We're going to discuss that today. So, Fergus Bordewich, first off, thank you so much for joining us once again.
Very, it's a great pleasure for me to see you, although I wish it were in person as it was last year, but this is not bad.
Right, absolutely. And, we are really excited to have you join us once again. And, we've got a lot that we want to kind of cover today in our deeper dive. Now, tomorrow we are going to be talking about Reconstruction. But up until now, in the Jessica Simpkins School for Human Rights this year, we have discussed several other topics leading up to Reconstruction, of course, including colonization, what will become known as South Carolina, the Revolutionary period, and just last week, the antebellum period and the U.S. Civil War. All topics that Fergus has actually written about in his wonderful books. And again, in case you don't know, he has published several important works on U.S. history, including Bound for Canaan, the Underground Railroad, and the War for the Soul of America, Washington, the Making of the American Capital, America's Great Debate, Henry Clay, Stephen A. Douglas, and the Compromise that Preserved the Union, the First Congress, how James Madison, George Washington, and a group of extraordinary men invented the government, Congress at War, how Republican reformers fought the Civil War, defied Lincoln, ended slavery, and remade America, and his most recent book, which I have right here, Plan War, Ulysses S. Grant, and the Battle to Save Reconstruction. So, before we get into talking about some of these various topics and books, I am curious. Um, what is it that drives your writing of U.S. history? Because you've covered so many different topics in your works over the years. Is there a through line we're trying to establish in
Ways, and I'll try to be concise. That's not my strong point, by the way, concision, but I'll try. Uh, on one hand, I was a journalist I was a foreign correspondent for years before I began writing history about 30 years ago. And much of what I covered when I was working abroad, and that's in the Far East, South Asia, the Middle East, Iran, as a matter of fact, and elsewhere in the world, Europe. I was very preoccupied with uh, aspects of human rights, uh, racial issues, uh, countries that we don't understand very well. I could give you a list, I'll skip that. Countries that we don't understand, Iran being one of them, by the way. Uh, and the price we as Americans have paid for stumbling into problems that we don't understand and are not in a position to solve because we don't know enough. Anyway, a lot of my journalism was in that kind of broad sphere, not only. Now I came back to the United States uh, uh, and began working on books in the end of the 80s, early 90s. Uh, I began asking questions about the United States that I hadn't thought about for quite a while. Now, this comes to the other part of my answer, which is to say, I grew up in a home that was very preoccupied with political and social issues. My mother spent World War II getting Japanese Americans out of our internment camps. And after that, she worked for many years until her death with American Indians on reservations all around the country. So I spent a fair bit of my childhood on and off reservations. It wasn't my home, but we were often there. And uh, that's another version. There's African American America and there's Native American America. It was another country, so to speak. And I think you know what I'm talking about here. people who absolutely were not part of the American mainstream. And there was a world out there. There was a world out there, and it really challenged me even as a kid to kind of think about people who were not uh, uh, part of what we, for want of a better, simpler term, call the American mainstream. Uh, and so my books, all of them to some degree, address issues of this type. Different degrees. The Underground Railroad is obviously, we know what the Underground Railroad was. And I mean, I began that book with a long section about slavery on the assumption that most people, well, they sort of heard about the Underground Railroad, but they really did not necessarily understand what the warp and woof of slavery was. Um, so it's very, very strong about what were people running away from, you know? Again, I think I'm speaking to people. I don't need to explain that on this Zoom, but to a wider readership, I felt I did. And the book I wrote about the foundation of Washington, called, not very imaginatively, Washington, the making of the American capital, is in large, it was how the city of Washington came to be, and it's how it was interwoven with the history of slavery. That's to say, it was placed for political reasons in a part of the country where slavery would be protected, Maryland, Virginia, and enslaved people built the great buildings, the U.S. Capitol, the White House, other buildings. Those are people who were hired from their enslavers, their owners, by the commissioners to build these beautiful buildings. You know, my point, the commonality here is to see how slavery was involved from the beginning and how it's inescapable as a part of American history. And I'm not going to spend more time talking about other books, but you get the drift, I guess.
Absolutely, no, and that's a great point that I'm glad you raised. It really kind of lays the groundwork for our conversation this afternoon. Now, before we continue on, just to let everybody know, when we advertise this, of course, we also advertise Dr. Vernon Burton to join us. Unfortunately, he's dealing with a serious family matter right now, so if you can keep him and his family in your thoughts and prayers, that would be greatly appreciated. Otherwise, he would certainly be here right now. But shifting to your work in terms of discussing U.S. history, we want to start actually with the plantation elite that were the founders of South Carolina. And could you talk a bit about the influence of South Carolina on the writing of the Constitution in particular?
Well, South Carolina is a small state. It's a very small state, actually. It was a small state at the time of the founding, and it's continued to be, which has punched above its weight, as we say, far above its weight. But at any rate, how was South Carolina founded? It was founded essentially through the agency of planters in Barbados. Barbados, as I expect your audience and you certainly know, was the most productive slave-based economy in the Americas in the 17th, 18th century. Sugar production, and uh, there was pressure to basically expand slavery beyond the shores of Barbados. And early on in the 18th, 17th century, South Carolina lent itself to plantation agriculture of the type that was practiced in Barbados. So it was, in a sense, a transplanting of that economy onto the mainland. Now, of course, it wasn't unique, but it was dynamic, which is to say, they were very successful at it. Uh, were there other plantations? Yes, but South Carolina was almost wholly developed by planters at the beginning. And you're, of course, we're only talking about the coastal area. It wasn't until much later that the upcountry, upstate was settled, and it was settled differently, sort of. Uh, uh, and I suppose if you, there's no place better in the former, let's say, former Confederate states, as they would eventually be, to study the impact, the power, the political power of slavery and institutionalized slavery and the slave-based economy than South Carolina. Enslaved people outnumbered white people. And outnumbered white people. I think there were only two states that at any point had majority black population, Mississippi being the other one. And uh, the when we look back from a perspective of 200 years, and we can't help looking at it through a moral lens. Of course we do. It's inescapable today. There's no way to be objective about the economy and the life that was imposed on enslaved people, and for that matter, secondarily, even on non-slave owning whites who were absolutely an underclass of a different type. Uh, uh, and yet, there was a logic, a kind of, if you like, a terrible economic logic to the expansion of slavery because it was profitable. It was profitable. People made money at it. Plantation owners made money. In contrast, I mean, what I'm going to say is not in any way meant to moderate the point, but planters in the Caribbean historically worked their slaves to death. It was cheaper to work enslaved people to death and buy fresh people than to sustain them with under healthier conditions. Okay, this is shocking. I mean, I think even today that economy is not well understood. The degree of mortality of enslaved people. Okay. It turned out, of course, that the mainland of North America, frankly, was richer. People lived longer. Okay, and this had to do not because masters were nurses, call them what you will, enslavers, masters, whatever. Not because they were more merciful, because they weren't. Conditions in South Carolina early on, especially, were just beyond belief horrible. I mean, I won't digress into examples. I could do that. I've written about some. I wanted, when I wrote about this, to really upset people.
Mhm.
You think it was okay? It wasn't okay. You think they were kind? No, they weren't kind. And at any rate, not to belabor what we all know. Um, uh, so, in a sense, you can say it's not an exaggeration. If it's an exaggeration, it's a very moderate one. That the plantation economy, as we came to know before the Civil War, grew out of South Carolina. It was more extensive. It was vaster in scale, especially relative to the populations. It was exactly what was replicated as settlement moved westward through Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. It was essentially the South Carolina model. So your question wasn't about all that. But it was about the Constitutional Convention and the Constitution. So uh, to take the hardest question first, okay, how could a country founded on principles of freedom, Declaration of Independence, the rights of all men, all white men with a certain amount of property, but okay. But the principle was there. This principle was there, and we've spent 250 years trying to make it, trying to hold the nation's feet to the fire on this. Okay, it was there, and of course came from the pen of Thomas Jefferson, a fairly large slave owner. But uh, the question being, how could a nation founded on principles of liberty tolerate, accept, and even institutionalize slavery, even though the word That is never stated as a fact in the Constitution. Yes, this is a nation founded on slavery. Of course, it's not there. You can look for it. It's not there because it was very touchy. It was very political, as we say. Uh, the Constitution is the result of as I'd say, sausage making, uh, a compromise, a compromise between states that were liquidating slavery slower than ideal, but were liquidating. They really did. We're talking about the northern states, obviously, and those that were absolutely adamant about preserving, protecting, and expanding slavery. It wasn't just protecting it, it was expanding it so that it would continue to move ever westward into these new lands, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Missouri, and so on. And uh, uh, not just South Carolinians, but every state um, that was whose economy was dependent on enslavement uh, would have failed to sign the Constitution. It couldn't have been ratified. It couldn't have been done. I mean, the argument you know, if you say, I mean, we all have these feelings. It was outrageous. They shouldn't, they should have let those states go. Well, how would that have benefited enslaved people when they didn't even have any pressure
Mm.
from the anti-slavery, increasingly anti-slavery North? I mean, this argument continues right up to the Civil War. Uh, it was an argument against secession, uh, sometimes for secession, sometimes against it. Um, and so we wind up with this thing, the famous three-fifths compromise, which is often kind of not properly expressed as saying that Black Americans are only three-fifths of a person. It looks that way. But that wasn't what was going on, actually. The southern states, the slave-owning states, like South Carolina, were demanding uh, uh, representation for the entire enslaved population. How could that be? Of course, slaves didn't have a vote whatsoever. They were completely excluded from the political system, but they got congressional representation for their population. So as it was, as a result of the compromise, yes, southern states, slave states, benefited from a bonus, an extra number of congressional seats because of that three-fifths of the Black population being counted. That bonus would have been that much more had every enslaved person been counted. So paradoxically, although it's hard to think of it this way, it was it was a compromise that was wrestled out of the southern states by anti-slavery Northerners. Is it sufficient in our modern point of view? No, of course not. But it was what was possible at the time. Now, of course, that helped feed the incredible presumption, entitlement, and arrogance of the slave states. Just
Right.
this assumption that they deserved to have more representation than any other states. And it's the same kind of entitlement that clearly you see right up through the Civil War, and especially the violent decades of the 1840s and 50s. They considered it outrageous that they should that and we're only talking about white people here, by the way. The idea of one man, one vote, they hated it. They weren't interested in it. And I think you can see that a hangover from these attitudes has lasted up to our present time in some fashion or other. Okay. But it was very potent in the 1780s, 1790s, and the first half of the 19th century. And South Carolina was in the forefront of the charge here. Um, uh, uh, and even at I've written a book, which I think maybe you referred to, called The First Congress.
Right.
Not a very exciting title either, I have to admit. But anyway, um, but it worked. Okay, I was okay with it. Um, Uh, if you're a writer, you're always wrestling over titles
Oh no, I understand. Trust me.
with your editors and publishers. Uh, but I've already said that at the Constitution would not have been signed by Southern states without a compromise on slavery. There were anti-slavery men, real proto-abolitionists at the
Mhm.
Constitutional Convention. Alexander Hamilton being one of them, who everybody knows. There were others. And they were very unhappy about that compromise. Gouverneur Morris, others. Their views about enslavement were like ours 250 years ago. These guys weren't all the same,
Right.
you know. Uh, but the crisis recurred during the first Congress. Congress had to begin somewhere. The Constitution didn't actually magically create government. It created a plan for government. Big difference. Uh, it was essentially a piece of paper that said, well, we should lay it out this way. Good luck. Let's see if you can do it. So the challenge for that first Congress was do it, turn this paper into a machine, into government, into something that works and can actually govern. Because what came before the Constitution was a flop, it was a failure. The Articles of Confederation, they didn't work. It was like 13 little mini countries. It's like the Balkans, like Bosnia Herzegovina and Croatia and Serbia. Um, anyway, so uh, was this machine going to work? Well, you find in the debates during the first Congress exactly the arguments over slavery that were made in defense of slavery that were made right up to secession in 1860 and 61. Okay, why is that? Uh, One, broadly speaking, states with slave-based agriculture, economies rather, were always protective of slavery. It was issue number one. They were always looking with wary eyes towards the north, where population was increasing at a greater rate, and uh, fearing that those guys up in Massachusetts and New York and eventually Ohio becomes a state, and is going to take away our slaves. This is all open. This is people who enslaved others loved slavery. They thought it was great. You know, they weren't ashamed of it. They thought it was great. They thought it was mandated by the Bible and so on. Not to mention it was really in their self-interest.
Mhm.
And so these discussions are all open. They're all public. Anyway, in the first Congress, our friends, the Quakers, uh, launched the very first lobbying campaign in American history. The first, calling upon Congress, the first Congress. Congress meets in New York at that time because Washington, D.C. doesn't exist yet. In New York, Quakers lobbied congressmen, and why we call it lobbying because the Quakers walked up to members of Congress in the lobby of Federal Hall, which was on Wall Street. Uh, there's no big finance on Wall Street then, it's just a street, okay? But they walked up in the lobby and took congressmen up by the lapels and said, I have something you need to do. You must legislate against slavery. Uh, uh, so this throws Congress into a panic. Congress has just barely begun. They don't even know if the machine's going to work. Uh, uh, James Madison was afraid not enough people would even show up to form a government. He was biting his fingernails. Uh, literally, by the way. I've seen his letters. Uh, and he was a rather sickly guy, and he was even sicker. Anyway, um, so what to do about these Quaker petitions? They submitted petitions. What to do about them? And the debate that took place at that time, which I wrote about at great length, uh, could be taking place in 1859.
Mhm.
Uh, and you have Southern members including the Pierce Butler of that time. There were a lot of Pierce Butlers. They just they kept cranking out Pierce Butlers generation after generation. You got to know which one you're talking about, which generation. Anyway, uh, uh, um, these men were pretty good orators. They stand up in Congress and give these passionate speeches and saying, "We're leaving. We're leaving. If these petitions are permitted on the floor, they weren't, by the way, permitted on the floor, we're leaving. We're leaving." And that threat was very potent in 1790, 1791, because government is only months old. And even those who opposed slavery uh, felt that without a government, we're nothing. What do we become? We'll just disintegrate. Um, and I'm citing this at some length
Right.
because, one, South Carolinians were in the forefront, as usual, of the defense of slavery. They weren't alone. I don't mean to suggest that. Um, and right at the beginning, out of the egg, so to speak, American government is afraid of slavery, or they're afraid of it, not slavery. They're afraid of anti-slavery.
Mhm.
They're afraid of anti-slavery. They will not discuss it. Uh, and the letters, I'm going to mention a source. I don't know where in South Carolina you can access it. It's not online. However, I'm going to guess that plenty of people on this Zoom have been in the state archives, of course, right there in Columbia, or in the South Caroliniana collection at the university. Anyway, there are 23 volumes of uh, the records of the first Congress. This is a project that was just completed a few years ago. I mean, it was brilliantly edited and collated by a team in Washington, D.C. Um, it's called First Federal Congress Project. The indexes are great. It's very, very reader friendly, not online, sad to say. But someday it should be, but these things cost money and they didn't have the money to do that. You can get these debates that I'm alluding to here, and they're absolutely fascinating, to read what the people, the men, they were all men, obviously, of the time were saying in real time. And there are plenty of South Carolinians in there, um, in all their glory, or as they certainly as they thought of it. Um, and I, may I say parenthetically here about South Carolina, uh, not all South Carolinians are kind of on the same. They're all on the same page when it comes to slavery, but on other issues of the time, they differ quite widely. I mean, one of the most pro-slavery members um, was also one of the strongest supporters of the Constitution. Uh, others uh, others were very skeptical about the Constitution. South Carolina, by and large, however, liked the Constitution, the constitutional government, especially as it evolved. Why? Because Alexander Hamilton's treasury was going to pay South Carolina's war debts from the Revolution. Very interesting. I mean, this may be getting too deep in the weeds for people here. But, different kinds of issues come into play. I'm emphasizing slavery but there are other very, very contentious issues. Is the national economy going to be capitalist or not? That was debated. That was debated, and people didn't really know what capitalism was by and large. And there was one member of Congress, and I don't remember his name offhand, is writing to another saying about Alexander Hamilton, and the one is writing to the other, what is this thing that Mr. Hamilton talks about called economics? follow me, there was no education in economics. It hadn't really been discovered as a science. Alexander Hamilton knew about it. Anyway, I don't. So even as he is an anti-slavery man, he is a proto-abolitionist.
Right.
He's a founder of the New York Manumission Society, and he writes some pretty radical stuff that even other members of that rather conservative society uh, are very uncomfortable with. In other words, people should be freed now. Shocker. No.
Fergus, if I can, I want to tell people what it was that I got from the first Congress. I knew a lot of the history, but what I got from your telling the history was the nuances that I don't learn in terms of everything's black and white, I think, in America when we cook it down. There's the good guys and the bad guys. And that it was the dialogues that you quoted and the personalities that you painted and the compromises that were made that made me appreciate more the vitality of the Constitution as it was written as a vision to get to. Because what we hear, and I mean, people now would dump on the founding fathers. They had slavery, boom, bad. Constitution, boom, bad. And it made me reflect more on the humanity, and that the humanity running Congress then was a lot more humane than the Congress running now. I just wanted to interject that so people get more than just the history. It was the flesh, the bones, and the personalities that I really enjoyed.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, the personalities were pretty varied. They ranged from a truly brilliant man, James Madison, truly brilliant. The better you know him, the more regardless of certain issues you might not like, he was a slave owner. Of course he was. A lot of slaves in Virginia. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. He was really the architect of the Constitution. And he was the go-to guy in Congress to explain it to others who didn't entirely understand it.
In his 20s,
Uh,
very young,
well, he's
early
born in
30s.
he's born in 57. Uh,
Okay.
he's 57. So he's early, very early 30s.
Yeah.
But here he is. He's the sickly guy. As I said earlier, he's sickly. He's kind of looks kind of undernourished. Um, and he speaks in a very whispery voice. So people in the back of the room, and we're talking about a fairly small room, the House of Representatives, people in the back are saying, "What did he say? What did he say?" Uh, so, and he's kind of got negative charisma as a person. But, I was about on the brink of saying Nixonian charisma, but I'm not going to. I shouldn't do that to James Madison. No, because Madison really contributed so much. And here you have, as I was starting to say before, Hamilton, who was this debonair guy, born out of wedlock in the Caribbean. But here he is in New York, and he was uh, the first financial thinker in American history. So on one hand, he's anti-slavery, and real seriously so. Uh, on the other hand, and you can have mixed reactions to this, it's really Hamilton who establishes capitalism as the foundation for the American economy. And I mean, it worked, by the way. I mean, we can parse that in a lot of different ways, but it worked. I mean, when I say what's the yardstick for whether something worked? It's whether the government survived. Right? It's whether the government survived, whether the economy functioned. And South Carolinians loved him. They didn't like him on slavery, but they loved him on economics because he paid the war debt.
Fergus, I bogged down about, I think you have something in there about Hamilton discovering capitalism. The word capitalism is not in the Constitution. And that people need to realize that what we see coming up in South Carolina in the 16 and 1700s is feudalism. And so when you go from feudalism to private ownership, that you don't have the master and you're working as, indentured or giving the master half of what you got. It was a giant step even to private property. And as we've taken more giant steps to predatory capitalism, I just wanted to um, put that dent into the way capitalism is practiced today. And thank Mr. Hamilton for making some money back then.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely true about feudalism, what you're saying. And I mean, okay, because I saw a question briefly come up there that's pertinent to this. I'm going to kind of address it. I mean, Hamilton didn't invent capitalism, obviously. It already existed and it had existed in some form in some places since the 14th century in Italy, then Northern Europe, England particularly. And it was very dynamic in England. Um, and that's Hamilton was essentially he studied how the Bank of England worked. What his goal was, what the goal was here was to, well, he introduced modern stock trading. Okay. Uh, he had an office down well, it was actually a coffee shop, Starbucks of the day, uh, some doors down from Federal Hall. Uh, and that was a new and a radical innovation uh, that did help build a dynamic economy. Okay. Uh, and the motivation here within government was how the United States was a debtor nation. It was the third world of its day. It was, I mean, pick a nation, pick your favorite basket case nation, whatever it is, that can't pay its debts, that's kind of financially on the rocks, that's begging for loans that from the IMF or from somewhere else, and nobody wants to lend because they're deadbeats. That was the United States in 1790. And Hamilton's great creation here was a system that enabled the country to use debt to borrow. I mean, it may sound like a bad idea. I don't think I'm going to get deep into the weeds trying to explain why uh, why that was innovative. Okay, but certain states, South Carolina being one of them, a key one, Massachusetts being another, the ones that had suffered most during the American Revolution. Uh, there were several states that were really on the rocks and hadn't paid their war debts, and they were being impoverished as a result. Okay, Hamilton came up with a plan for the country as a whole to combine the war debts of all the states. Some, like Virginia, had completely paid its debt. So had some others, some hadn't, as I said, and to create the national debt, so that and then the United States as a nation begin paying off those debts, so that he recovered American credit. The country became able to borrow money internationally from England mostly, England, France, and Holland. Uh, and I mean, this is the core. I mean, a core fact of the way capitalism works. Look, we're in the 1780s. We're not in 2026. We're talking about I can't say a primitive system. It wasn't primitive, but it was unfamiliar at the time. And the question that I saw fleetingly go across my screen was, well, what would there have been if Hamilton hadn't come up with something like this? Well, it would have been it would have fed the fragmentation of the United States. What would have been the fate of a deadbeat state like South Carolina, a deadbeat like Massachusetts, civil disorder? In Massachusetts, you did have civil disorder. You had Shays's Rebellion in Massachusetts of white farmers basically burning down courts, and so on. And similar events took place in Pennsylvania in the 1790s. Again, it had nothing to do with race. What would have been the consequences in southern states, notably South Carolina? Hard to say. It would have been whatever people could come up with Some states with good leadership might have found a way to thrive. Others, I mean, South Carolina might have become an economic colony of England, so to speak. I'm just throwing that out there. I mean, that's not a,
Mhm.
I'm not trying to make a strong case for that. But uh, uh, and you know, I mean, capitalism. I don't know. We can talk about capitalism as sort of getting maybe it's getting a bit far off topic here. But it changes like everything else. It changed. It changed as the country evolved, and especially after the Civil War. When it's only after the Civil War when you start to see the same kind of the same kind of animal that we talk
Mhm.
about in our own time or in the 20th century. Uh, uh,
Fergus, tie the Jefferson's concern about corporations, and generally, the founding fathers were aware that corporations were the vanguard of the king, and that the corporations have changed the nature of capitalism.
okay, well, okay. I think the key word here is your word of a few minutes ago, which is feudalism. And even though Jefferson, I mean, was in many ways extremely enlightened, in many ways, not always. Uh, he certainly wasn't on slavery exactly, but he Monticello, beautiful as it is, was essentially a feudal property. Plantations were feudal estates, very much modeled. I mean, plantation owners as late as the 1860s. I mean, thought they were living in Ivanhoe. Oh, a lot of people probably don't remember that anymore. That was Sir Walter Scott, major English novelist of the 19th century, who wrote particularly Ivanhoe, a incredibly popular bestseller of the day about that romanticized the Middle Ages, the feudal world. Okay, so Southern planters would actually have sort of Ivanhoe parties. They thought they were living in the Middle Ages because they were.
Fergus, I
They,
grew up in South Carolina. My teenage years were with the plantation set. Those people were still living in Ivanhoe.
yeah, I can't say I wish I were there, Brett. But uh, but okay, so I mean Jefferson and the let's call them feudal plantation owners. I mean they were suspicious of and fearful of money making, modern of commercial money making, of big business, of speculation, even though they were often speculators themselves in acquiring land, tracts of land. Uh, but it's also important to I think realize that economic instability was the norm. I mean, today we expect stability and we get very worried about, or some people do, about changes in the market and this and that. Uh, in the 18th century, well through the 19th, by the way, banks failed. There were very few banks, very few banks. Plantation owners sold their commodities and they bought and on credit usually they bought the consumer goods they wanted and then raised their own food, of course, and it was as you implied a feudal way of life. Uh, uh, they saw investment and even early stockholding uh, as making money from not working. Uh, they found it on one hand very suspicious that I could cite some names there, like Robert Morris, a very interesting figure whom I've written about, or Hamilton for that matter. Uh, uh, we're conjuring money out of the air, and that um, making money by charging interest often felt was immoral. I mean, did it happen? And of course, it happened in the South too. but there was a very, not unlike the very conservative Islamic attitude towards banking today. And conservative Islamic societies go through all sorts of contortions to say that banking isn't banking. I mean, we're calling it by other names because it's not that kind of profit making is not normal. And I mean, these attitudes continue. I mean, right up to the Civil War. I mean, there was virtually no investment in the South. There were exceptions. I'm well aware of it. There's very, very little investment in the South before the Civil War. After the war, it becomes dynamic. Railroad building, among other things. I mean, there are certain cities that were insignificant before Atlanta. It was nothing. It was a railroad junction. In fact, correct me if I'm wrong. Atlanta's first name was Terminus.
Right.
Am I right?
Yeah, exactly.
End of the railroad. So the line ended. It wasn't. There was no metropolis there. There were no factories, and a lot of that most of that comes after the war. Couple of exceptions.
Mhm.
So Brett, did I address that or not?
Yeah, you did. I'm going to get you to talk about the differences in having Northern Democrats being against disunion, but in favor of slavery. I mean, there were all these mixed blends, the Copperheads, and then you had, so unpack that, or that, because I didn't understand that there were people in the North that had both those impressions
Uh,
and in the South.
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, it's very interesting. Let's say it's fascinating. Okay.
That's why I asked you.
To start with, we have to remind people that the two parties were very different then than they are today. Okay.
Okay.
Before the Civil War, you had the Democrats, the first part, the oldest party, basically the Jeffersonians, uh, and the Whigs, who were a more business-oriented party, but not strictly so. And the Whigs become, the core of the Republican Party. The Republican Party, which develops in the 1850s, comes into being as a more business-oriented party, but that's not the strict dividing line. There were plenty of the Democratic Party tended to be run by rich people too. It's pretty complicated, but the Republican Party comes into being as an enemy of the expansion of slavery. Okay. All its components oppose the expansion of slavery. That's not the same as being abolitionist. Abolitionists are people who wanted to end slavery. Immediate abolitionists want to end it now, this morning, today. And that was only one element, not the majority in the Republican Party. The Democratic Party professes these Jeffersonian ideas that we were just talking about, states' rights, a greater emphasis on states' rights, but often in the northern states also have often act on principles of states' rights also, even those that are Whig or Republican governed on certain issues. So this is not a neat dividing line either, except that in the Democratic Party, the entire party supports states' rights. There's not much debate in it. And the party the Democratic Party of the time was this kind of a chimera, a strangely put together animal, let's say, of Southern defenders of slavery. Southern Whigs also tended to defend slavery too, but within the context of the time, were sometimes somewhat less radical on it. Okay, sometimes. But Southern Democrats staunchly protected slavery in all its forms and challenged anything that threatened slavery. Southern Whigs sometimes would cooperate more with Northern Whigs, and Uh, Northern Whigs. Northern Whigs. Not enough has been written about sorry, I said Whigs. I'm talking about Democrats. Northern Democrats deserve a lot more attention from historians than I think they've generally gotten, which is to say the Northern Democratic Party before the Civil War consisted of um, Democrats who were wholly allied, states' rights Democrats who happened to live in northern states, and were wholly allied, completely congruent with the interests of southern slaveholding states. No light between them. There was that element. There were also northern Democrats who were anti-slavery. They believed in Jacksonian, Jeffersonian values, more agrarian in orientation, broadly speak, very suspicious of banks, very suspicious of banks, tended to be opposed to federal support for public works, canal building, railroad building, things like that. But nonetheless, we're anti-slavery. And that party, the Democrats will split in 1860, right down the middle. Right down the middle over this. It's why the Democrats really were washed out in the 1860 election. Why Lincoln was elected. He was with a plurality only. Never had a majority. He had no votes in no electoral votes in southern states whatsoever. Regional candidate, minority. And when I say minority, I'm just talking about the minority of white voters. Nobody else was voting to speak of. So the Democratic Party is not as other parties have been in American history, kind of this strange combination of pieces that don't really fit together very well. That happened to the Whigs also, who Southern Whigs tended to oppose secession. When you see statistics on secession in southern states, and there's often a fairly significant minority voting against secession where they could vote. Brett, correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think South Carolinians got to vote on it, on secession. Am I right? I don't think there was a popular. I don't think there was a popular vote in South Carolina. They didn't want to risk it. In North Carolina, right up the road, so to speak, there was a huge vote against secession, not a majority. It was close, actually. But where everybody, white people could vote, white men could vote in North Carolina, there was a very substantial vote against secession, as there was in Tennessee also, and some other states. Those are often Whigs. Those are Whigs who don't know what to do with themselves. I mean, they're often themselves slave owners. They have an interest in slavery, but they tend to be much more loyal to the national project and the idea of they don't like the idea of secession. They believe that the Constitution is a sacred document. And if you were to ask, why did Northerners actually fight? And you read their letters, Northern soldiers, why did they fight in the Civil War? Most frequently, if they speak of something larger than that, I'm sticking with my buddies. We all signed up and we're going to fight together. You get past that, when they look into themselves for larger values, it's to protect the sanctity of the Constitution. They're inspired to a degree that Americans today can hardly imagine, I think, that these founding documents inspired people. I mean, really deeply inspired people. And the Constitution, which I think most junior high school students, which I guess where you get it, oh my God, I can't, the words are so big, or whatever. But in the 19th century, people were so immensely proud of having this. We're the only country in the world that has a constitution like this. It's the only one,
Fergus, now we're the only industrial democracy in the world with a two-party system. And I wanted you to speak to the term sectionalism. that Washington used, warning against the
Yeah,
power of the slave states.
yeah.
And that turned into parties, and I don't know when that happened. The parties started pretty soon after that.
Okay. Yes, yes, but I'm going to slightly take issue with part of your point, Brett,
Uh,
just slightly, which is to say there were a bunch of sections at the time. People in the, let's say, the 1780s, 1790s, when they talked about sectionalism, they weren't just talking about North and South. I mean, we see that from a Civil War, 19th century perspective, when that is what we're talking about. But in the 18th century, there were at least four sections. Okay, east, west, east, west, north, south. Sometimes mid-Atlantic is a section by itself. Uh, these 13 entities.
Nine.
Had these 13 entities, and this is discussed a lot. I mean, this isn't a theory that's special to me, but if you read the dialogues, the discourse of the time, um, uh, there was widespread concern that the West, and what they meant by the West was west of the Appalachians. Forget Montana, it didn't exist. Wyoming, it doesn't exist. We're talking about west of the Appalachians. We're talking about what becomes the Ohio Territory, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, which are just the first people are moving, white people are moving in there. Even talking about Tennessee, Kentucky, uh, um, Mississippi, and so on, the West. That's the West at the time. And there was widespread fear those entities, those states would just go off on their own and become a separate country. Okay. Um, and perhaps become the pawns of European powers, French, Spanish, British. Okay. When you're talking about the North, well, sometimes the North was New England. Sometimes it included New York. Sometimes it didn't. Mid-Atlantic, sometimes in Maryland, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Delaware, sometimes New Jersey, sometimes not. Anyway, so the configuration was different. Okay, but what was Washington's anxiety? That they wouldn't all hold together. They wouldn't all hold together because they weren't Americans of the time didn't see themselves as a nation as we do today. You're probably aware that very commonly before the Civil War, when people wrote the term United States, it was a plural, not a singular. After the Civil War, it became the United States is. Before the Civil War, it was the United States are. In other words, were they really a nation or just a bunch of kind of allied, as many Southerners thought, just allied statelets, like Bosnia-Herzegovina, as I said earlier, uh, uh, and the possibility of the country flying apart was very real to the founders. It was very real. They worried about it. They lost sleep over it, right up through the War of 1812, when, as maybe people here already know, there was a secession movement during the War of 1812, but it was New England. There was a secession conference held, I think, in Providence, Rhode Island. And
Well, were
uh,
those
Right.
sectionalisms you referred to, what were they sectionalized about? Was it their economy?
okay.
Was it their agriculture? Was it the industry? Was it the religion?
Ah. Okay, you know, people, I'm thinking of actual documents, letters that exist where, uh, people, Virginians, South Carolinians, take your pick, that can't understand people from New England. What are they talking about? Uh, oh, those Pennsylvanians, you can't trust them. The kinds of prejudices that we think of more familiar, maybe in a cliched version of Europe, applied to the different states at the beginning. They didn't know anything about each other. I mean, you couldn't go anywhere. There were hardly any roads. People didn't travel more than down to the local tavern. They did during the Revolution, but not all that much. It was very hard to go anywhere. It took days to get, say, from could be from Charleston. I'm thinking of a particular case. No, actually, it was Norfolk. It took days to get from Norfolk to Philadelphia by boat. And there's a guy I wrote about in my book, The First Congress. He was a senator from Virginia, who was, in the course of trying to get to Congress, that's from Norfolk to Philadelphia, was first shipwrecked. He was shipwrecked off the coast of New Jersey. Okay, ship was blown this way and that, kaboom, and he had to crawl onto the sand. Okay, he's an old guy too. He was about 70 something years old. And then he had to get a stagecoach to travel days and days on roads that were nothing but holes. And then he was land wrecked when the stagecoach toppled over and gave him a concussion. People didn't travel that much. So I'm saying they didn't know each other. They didn't know each other. So sectionalism was largely rooted, but not only, in this kind of ignorance. Okay, when it comes to economics, yes, there's slavery in some states and absence of slavery in some other states. Though, you have to, as far as slavery goes, well, slavery existed in some form in most northern states up through the 1820s. Okay, New York didn't end slavery until 1827. New Jersey had a handful of enslaved people at the beginning of the Civil War. So if you're talking about the 1780s, 1790s, slavery matters, but not in the way that it does later. When in the 19th century, it becomes this red line. Slave states, free states, border states, and so on. To some extent, it's economic. Yes, a plantation agriculture in the South. But bear in mind that New York, north of New York City, has some of the biggest plantations in the country, all the way up the Hudson River to Albany. They are worked by white, pretty much indentured farmers who are bound to the land. There are two tenant rebellions in New York in the 1840s over this kind of arrangement. So, in some respects, it's not race-based, but not economically, it's not so different. So, I mean, sectionalism, when it becomes, let's say, rooted in slavery, it becomes increasingly violent, and especially as public opinion shifts in the North. It takes years. I mean, most Northerners didn't care about slavery, frankly, it's sad to say. Stephen A. Douglas, let's take Stephen A. Douglas, who is, I think most people are reasonably familiar with. He was the senator from Illinois who debated Abraham Lincoln in the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates, okay, and beat Lincoln also. And Douglas was born in Vermont, northern Vermont. That's where he came from, as Yankee as you can get. Moved to Illinois to start his legal career. Very successful, like Lincoln, very successful as a lawyer, better educated than Lincoln. Small guy who looked like a steam engine. He was often called that, a steam engine, anyway. Douglas is a Democrat. Douglas is a highly partisan Democrat, Jacksonian Democrat, longer lineage Jeffersonian Democrat, highly partisan. He also owned slaves. He had properties in, I believe, both Mississippi and Louisiana. It might only have been Mississippi. There were slave plantations. Did he boast about it in Illinois? No, he didn't, but he had them. He had them and profited from them. And he's an example of the kind of Democrat, as we were talking about earlier, who was completely, I mean, it's wedded at the waist to the interests of the South, of Democrats in the South. Now, yeah, in the 1850s, he kind of tries to square the circle by being kind of, because public opinion is changing in the North from lack of interest in slavery through discomfort with slavery towards resentment about slavery towards, in some areas, hatred of slavery. It's never all one piece. It's never all one piece. But here's a politician like Douglas, who's trying to somehow pilot himself around these reefs and shoals and still get elected to office. He was the Democratic presidential candidate in 1860. As we all know, Lincoln won, but there were four candidates. There were four candidates that year. Southern Democrats went one way, Northern Democrats went with Douglas. It's called the American Party, but there were Whigs. It was a kind of Whig rump, and then there were the Republicans in the North. And I think it's really, I think that notion of the North as an entity parallels finally the South's sense of itself. South Carolina is always kind of the heart and mind of the pro-slavery South. I mean, there's almost nowhere in the South where you'll have men writing as, dare I say, eloquently and as passionately on behalf of slavery. There's some who are not South Carolinians, but I mean, South Carolina always seems to be kind of on the cusp of trying to secede. You pick a year. There are people talking about secession in South Carolina. And, you understand, not sympathize, but you understand if the prospect of ending slavery in South Carolina means, as it briefly did during Reconstruction, a black majority, a black voting majority, blacks, at least, if not a functional majority, at least dominating politics, influencing, let's say, strongly influencing politics. And South Carolina, and it's no coincidence that the two states that are the most violent in the violent post-war world are those with the largest black populations and the most absolutely vicious repression in a landscape of viciousness. It's not to let anybody off the hook.
Well, and to that point, because I know we want to get to the Q&A pretty soon, but about Reconstruction, your book Klan War really centers the importance of Ulysses Grant as president during the Reconstruction period. And you mentioned in particular South Carolina several times this afternoon. I think that South Carolinians made a pastime of talking about secession from the Union in the 18th and 19th centuries. But with Reconstruction, what was it about Grant's leadership during the Reconstruction period that makes him so important? And especially what's going on in South Carolina, because the state plays a pivotal role in Klan War as well.
Yeah, well, here, this is my favorite subject. Yes, you're right. I put a strong focus on Grant. Ulysses Grant was our first civil rights president. I'm not being glib, or I'm being a little glib, I mean, Grant, okay, very briefly. I mean, Grant was born in Ohio, southern Ohio. His father was an abolitionist. Grant, as a younger person, was not a political man. He was a soldier, went to West Point. It came from what you would call today a middle class of that era, a kind of middle class, lower middle class background. His father was a tanner, a businessman. I mean, modest scale, not unsuccessful, but Grant became a soldier. He was, if anything, probably a registered Democrat before the 1850s, as were most military officers, because that was the party of power. And that is not unusual, especially in the 19th century, that people who wanted advancement in the military were nominally, regardless of what they believed, members of the party of power because they would be more likely to be promoted. Okay. But what's remarkable about Grant is that he was not an abolitionist as in the pre-war times, but he very rapidly, once the war began, um, uh, saw that abolition was going to come, and he accommodated himself. And I don't mean that in a belittling way. He said, "This is," and he it touched something in himself. Touched something in himself. He was very egalitarian in his own life, regard to all kinds of people. And he very early in the war, he was one of the first officers to accept the recruitment of Black troops. And not only the recruitment of, but to have Black troops in his armies. There were others. The brilliant general and his friend, William Tecumseh Sherman, also an Ohioan, was a deep-dyed racist. Great general, great general, but a deep-dyed racist. Sherman would not allow any Black troops in his army. He could have had tens of thousands of extra men. He didn't want them. Okay. I'm just doing this to point up Grant's character. And he became a radical. He became, in the course of the war, well, not so much of the war itself. He's already adapted to emancipation, completely adapted to emancipation, supports recruitment of Black troops, as I said. And in the post-war years, he's commander of the armies under the opprobrious President Johnson, Andrew Johnson, whom rock bottom until I could mention a much more recent president, but I probably don't need to.
Dr. Greene, put the Klan Wars in context for the people that haven't been in the Modjeska school.
Okay. The title of the book, as Brett just said, is Klan War. The Ku Klux Klan was invented in 1866 by a group of Confederate veterans in Tennessee, and it spread like wildfire over the course of a couple of years, really about 2 years, over all the former Confederate states, and even into Kentucky, which was not a Confederate state. And it started out as, I'm simplifying here somewhat, started out as kind of a crazy young guys joking around in crazy costumes, and it did not start as initially as a terrorist organization focused on freed people, but it pretty rapidly became that by dressing up these guys, and by now it's spreading over states, town to town, state to state, can by disguising themselves in costumes, they can perpetrate things they might not do in broad daylight, they might not do without a mask. And as we can see, actually, with the behavior of ICE currently in the United States, and its behavior in cities around the United States, these guys are all masked. I am skeptical that if the ICE characters who are intimidating, attacking, beating up, threatening, ordinary men, women, and children, if they didn't have masks on, I doubt that a lot of that would be happening the way it's happening if they could be identified, named, and charged. Anyway, so it's not a bad analogy with the Klan, except the Klan is deadly. I mean, really deadly. Yes, we know 2 people have been killed in Minneapolis and somebody else as well. But the Klan's MO within a year or 2 was deadly terror. Was deadly terror against primarily freed people, men, women, sometimes children. They perpetrated appallingly sadistic crimes against people, but also against white Republicans, fewer in number, but a very significant number, because in order to build a Republican Party in the South, that had to be a biracial party to be viable. And it started out as a biracial party. Uh, Plenty of whites were Unionists during the war, and they kept their heads down. Some of them had even been drafted into the Confederate Army and became Republicans as soon as the war ended. Um, and that started out not badly, that experiment of biracial politics in the South. Very significant in most Southern states, not all. So the Klan was at war with freed people because they were free, with white Republicans because they collaborated with black people, and with democracy. It was a war against democracy per se, because democracy meant government by a mixed race coalition. Okay. Anyway, um, is that a cat I see, Brett? Maybe.
A cat on my keyboard, excuse me.
Yeah.
The through line is that in 1871, the complaints from South Carolinians and the South Carolina congressional representatives were blowing the top off of things about the Klan violence and the utilization of martial law and suspending habeas corpus in 9 upstate counties in South Carolina was really, I think, and you speak to this, is one of the last strong gasp of the federal efforts to protect Reconstruction. In 1871 and 72, 900 people in New York County alone were arrested. And the trials were in Columbia, and we've got the transcripts of those trials and contemporaneous reports of them. And you could change that for January 6th, and damn, it looks about the same.
Yes, it does. It does. Yeah, South Carolina was really the epicenter of the federal effort to shut down the Klan. And I will tell you, Grant succeeded. He did succeed in shutting down the Klan. He went to war against the Klan. And that was a two-pronged war. One of it was judicial. Basically, he appointed prosecutors willing to prosecute the Klan, which was the failure of prosecutors to do that beforehand was one reason for the Klan's rapid expansion. Local authorities often were kind of unreconstructed Confederates, frankly, and this gets into a lot of complicated issues. But federal prosecutors prosecuted the Klan and charged them often, not always, with pretty severe crimes. They were liable to, theoretically, to the death penalty for committing acts of terror, but to very, very large fines or imprisonment in federal penitentiaries. Not enough were put in them. Okay, we can get to that in a few minutes, perhaps, if you want to. But the epicenter was South Carolina, Grant, where much of upstate South Carolina had essentially been taken over by the Klan, and where in around and the federal effort was centered in York County, but it spread over other counties up there, nine counties as well. Um, Troops were also sent down. Grant sent in the 7th Cavalry, which is, yes, it was, my friends, that's the same 7th Cavalry that got massacred at the Battle of Little Bighorn, not long afterward, a few years afterward. And some of these same soldiers that were putting down the Klan in South Carolina were killed in Montana. But anyway, that's another story entirely. And Grant one, he sent the cavalry down there, other units too, not only cavalry, and he sent officers who hunted down the Klan, who actually hunted them out in their farms, who, with the collaboration of African American freed people, who I mean, I've been asked this question. Well, how could black people help expose the Klan? Well, what it really boils down to, and this is in the documents at the time, it was that the farmers who employed freed people, often their former slaves, thought that they were too dumb to pay attention what was happening on the property. And frequently, Klansmen were meeting on these farms up there, and African Americans who worked on the farms, just heard everything. And once the federal government had sent soldiers down there, they informed. So they informed the troops who was responsible for what and who was doing what, who had killed whom, and so on. So at any rate, yeah, for about 2 years, this was a very vigorous and effective campaign. Grant figured if I can break it in South Carolina, they'll know I can break it anywhere. And Klan activity pretty much evaporated. Okay, there's an after story here. I mean, obviously, we evolved into a 100 years of Jim Crow repression. So just destroying the Klan wasn't enough to break the whole regime of white supremacy, which in fact got stronger. And I'll just say in a word or two, because it's otherwise people say, well, how? That what happened was that the Republicans, who were supported Grant and supported the campaign against the Klan, lost the election of 1874. Not the famous election, but they lost the House of Representatives. Money bills originate in the House of Representatives. Southern Democrats, including plus Northern Democrats, choked off the funding for the Army and for the prosecutors. They just choked it. And Grant was no longer able to act. And finally, it's also true that Northern public opinion kind of lost interest in the problem. Oh my God, it's the South again. Oh, there's more violence. No, I don't want to hear about it. And I'm being a bit light on the subject, but it's nobody wants to hear about Ukraine anymore. In our own moment. Oh, wasn't that a couple of years ago? Public opinion in a democracy, flawed as it may be, only retains issues for a while.
Absolutely. And I think to your point, imagine that midterm elections actually having consequences. I want to shift to the Q&A, but I want to read actually a section from the preface to Klan War, which I think sums up what Fergus has been talking about this afternoon. He wrote at the end of his preface about Reconstruction, what happened then still matters. The urgency of containing domestic terrorism and racial zealotry have not gone away, nor has the need to protect basic civil rights, including the right to vote. This is a work of history, not a prescription for meeting the nation's present-day challenges. But the story it tells shows that forceful political action can prevail over violent extremism. It also shows that when political courage succumbs to partisan self-interest, the darker impulses that are always present in America inherit a fertile ground in which to thrive. On that cheerful note, let's go ahead and transition to the Q&A. Again, this has been wonderful, but I know folks have plenty of questions for you. So if you have questions, you can put them in the chat or go ahead and unmute yourself. Okay, so there's a question from Cecil Rigby, a longtime supporter of the school. Please talk a bit about Frederick Douglass's support of Grant. Did he initially more or less like Grant? If not, what changed his mind? Thank
you. Yeah, good question. Well, Douglass recognized that I'm sorry, I just got a message from my staff. Now it's actually my wife. It's okay. Got nothing to do with the school. I'm sorry. It's more the other way around. I'm more her staff, actually. And anyway, Douglass recognized that Grant was genuine, that he was sincere is an overused kind of pallid word, but that he was a man who meant what he said, and that his actions spoke on behalf of Black Americans and his actions against racism in the South. Grant was not a racist, and plenty of people who were anti-slavery were racist. They weren't people who would commit racist crimes, but they were people with color prejudice. Grant apparently was not. He opened the White House to Black visitors. First time. Douglas had been in Lincoln's White House with other people as well. But Grant opened the White House, just ordinary anybody in those days could visit the White House. Really, you just walk up to the White House, knock on the door, somebody let you in, and you sat on a chair until the president had some time and he talked to you. Believe it or not, no security whatsoever. Uh, and when there was a specific event when black visitors or a visitor turned up, and the doorman, who was probably black, by the way, went up and said, "I can't let them in, can I?" And he said, "Yes, yes, you can." And it doesn't sound like much, but it was a watershed. It was a precedent. So Douglas saw what kind of man he was, and he was very loyal to Grant. Uh, I cannot personally think of anything that Douglas said that was negative about Grant. I mean, Douglas even Douglas even supported policies of Grant that most historians don't really like. Um, Grant was passionate about acquiring Santo Domingo for the United States. It sort of resembles a certain president we have at the moment about wanting to acquire, I'm going to take this country and that country. I mean, Grant wasn't as harsh as that. I mean, he saw it as a place that it was an alternative place for Black Americans to go if they wanted to. Nobody was going to be deported to it. But there was also a kind of other element to this where people around Grant really were very imperialistic minded and wanted to make a profit from acquiring a colony. Okay, Frederick Douglass totally supported this acquisition. And I think there are people who find that inexplicable because it's gone down in history as kind of a somewhat unsavory operation. We never did take it it's an American these days. But very loyal to Grant. I think there was a real partnership there and a like-mindedness.
No, I think that's a really good point. And by the way, in the chat, I did put a link to the book Exporting Reconstruction, a recent book by Ryan Sims. It's a great book about Grant's Reconstruction policies in terms of foreign policy and how all these things tie together. Any other questions? So we've got some time for additional questions for Fergus. I have a question of my own, but I want to allow others a chance to ask questions too. Any other questions for Fergus?
I have a question. I don't want to sound ignorant or anything, but to understand that South Carolina and Mississippi had more of a black population than white population, how is it now that we have such oppressive laws and rules and now that go against the black people that were more populated in these states and the southern states than the other cultures?
But in the Civil War era, the mid-19th century, I mean, it's not the same today, even though both states obviously have pretty large black populations. They're not majority, not even close to majority today. So what happened? Two things happened. I can answer it simply. One, black voters, and voters are what we're really talking about here, were scared into silence by terror, by the Klan's terror. They were killed. People were killed. They weren't just intimidated, though that too. People were killed, in numbers. In York County, and the Hamburg massacre in South Carolina in 1876, an appalling massacre. The numbers weren't large. I mean, every life is valuable, but I mean, the numbers killed were not large. But it was an act of deliberate terror against, up to that point, empowered black citizens. Okay, people were silenced, and over time, over a couple of generations, people left. I mean, they went to New York, went to Chicago, went to Philadelphia, and the Great Migration of people to the North changed demographics in the South. So that I mean, whites, one way or another, discovered a majority they hadn't originally had. A new majority, white majority, was created in those states, and I mean, that's the simplest answer.
Mhm. Absolutely.
Well,
Any Go ahead.
Jim Crow is like a dynamic thing that I remember when there were no black people elected in South Carolina when I went to college. And so there's been a racist suppression of participation, as well as the gerrymandering that kicked in, that reduced their effective power. There's Hampton.
All right. Any more questions? Loretta has a comment in the chat. She said, "Just visited an art exhibit and saw Mississippi appendectomy," which she relates to eugenics, um, which is, again, I think, a really important aspect of Jim Crow that we'll be getting into weeks to come. Any additional questions for Fergus?
Dr. Greene, I guess I don't want to let him go without asking him one from Bound to Canaan
Well,
because,
I see So Cahoon has a question. I think he just raised
okay.
his hand.
I do. Fergus, why were so many convicts or persons who were convicted of Klan activity in South Carolina sent to the federal penitentiary in Albany, New York, rather than federal pens closer to the South? Do you know? Is there a reason?
Yes, yeah. It's a surprising answer, actually. There were no federal penitentiaries. It was a contract. The federal government signed a contract with Albany because Albany had room for them.
That was the
And
first federal prison?
well, it wasn't actually. It was a New York State prison penitentiary, but the federal government just signed a contract
Hmm.
to take those men. Now, since you brought this up, I want to clarify something. The numbers actually were all too few. Okay. Many, I mean, thousands of Klansmen were convicted. Comparatively few actually served time. Why? Because as I said earlier, the mood in the country, the North changed, and two, Congress refused to appropriate money. Okay. These two things are happening simultaneously. Um, and I mean, even a um, northern philanthropist who visited Klansmen in the penitentiary in Albany, suggested that they deserved mercy, from as a humane gesture. Look, you ask me, how could that be? Garrett Smith is the person I'm talking about here, who was one of the men who financed John Brown. Garrett Smith, he was a very wealthy, for his time, left-wing philanthropist. Visited Klansmen in the penitentiary, and he came out and urged Grant to let them out. Go ahead.
Can you talk a little bit about why Grant granted such pardons to these Klansmen after, what, 1873 or so?
It comes back essentially to politics again, that the country was no longer behind him. The North was no longer behind him. That is tragic. I mean, this is where the Republican Party has changed. It's no longer it's less and less, let's put it this way, less and less the party of progressive values and idealism and moral action, and more the party of power and big money.
Is it your opinion that he granted them pardons due to political pressure, or did he grant them pardons because he would have granted them pardons anyway? I suspect that's not the case, but help me understand.
No, the former. It was because it's political pressure. The public isn't behind him anymore on this. It's also when you read Grant's letters of that period, the man is sad about this. it's easy for us to say, well, he should have done the right thing anyway. Well, that's not commonly the case in politics. And he had all kinds of things he was struggling with. He was under attack, mostly unjustly, but not entirely unjustly, for corruption within his administration. Grant was not corrupt. Misapprehension. It's a lie. That's a lost cause era lie. Grant was not corrupt at all. He was very, very decent man that way. But his judgment and people was sometimes not so great. True. Well, that's true. Congress wasn't behind him anymore. There were fewer and fewer radicals in Congress. Some of them had aged out, some had died. Thaddeus Stevens died in 68. Thaddeus Stevens would have gone up to Albany and strangled those guys personally, had he been alive. Ben Wade, the great senator from Ohio, another staunch radical, he lost office. And some of those radicals basically became somewhat more conservative. Slavery's over, it has been ended. We're done. We're done. And they moved on to other issues. The great issue of that era, after say 1870s, is civil service reform, which sounds pretty white bread to us, but it was a big issue at the time. I won't digress into it. And that is what's really taken over the great national debate. And you want to shake people and say, look, the great issue of the moment, the great issue of the time is what's happening in the South now. You're going to lose a century of progress here if you don't stand up. And they didn't stand up. I mean, there were individuals who did. It's not universal. I mean, they were Albion Tourget. I don't know if the name Albion Tourget or Turgi, as some people pronounce it. He's writing up to 1910. He's writing these passionate and very eloquent articles attacking what's happening in the South. Albion Tourget was a former Union officer, a four-square abolitionist, committed himself to trying to transform politics in North Carolina, and was ultimately forced out. But I mean, I cite him because he's somebody. Yes, and the biography of Tourget that's around is first rate. If you want to read a brilliant, passionate book about that era, the Jim Crow era from a totally different perspective, from somebody who kind of never surrendered on civil rights. Biography. I can't remember the author's name, but it's just called, I think, Albion Tourget. It's a very good book. Anyway, sorry, Cecil. I can't stop till I get on some of these things.
I'm glad you pointed that out, though. That was really important. And although I will say that I think, unfortunately, in recent years we've learned that civil service work is not as white bread as we thought it used to be. But that's a whole other conversation.
Yeah.
Any more questions, Brett? Did you want to add something?
Well, I don't want to tie up more time, and Fergus has long answers. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say what he said at the closing of the Bound for Canaan book, which was about the Underground Railroad. He mentioned something in his closing, that the Underground Railroad forced Americans to rethink the compromises to slavery and face its moral consequences. My God, Fergus, how do we get them to do that again? In 2 minutes or less, how do we save America?
Well, okay, look, an optimist might say, I'm feeling less confident about the country than I was even a year ago. Okay, so just to tell you where I'm coming from, but an optimist would say, well, you don't learn these lessons overnight. I mean, I would like to think that seeing, the little kids dragged off to detention centers, and guys, elderly guys in their underwear being dragged out of their houses, and people being shot down or beaten down or dragged along the street in American cities. I mean, this looks like, look, this is like, frankly, it's like Germany in 1933. I wasn't there, but I know we all know what happened and what it was like. That if we have any faith in the American people across the entire spectrum, seeing what the truth of what's happening may be something like meeting those fugitive slaves turning up in your towns in Ohio or Michigan or New York in 1850 or 1855 or 60, uh, uh, and saying, "Oh my God, that's what it's like. Is that really happening in our country?" And that changed countless northern opinions in those years. And I mean, we're seeing things that in the context of our own time are 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 comparably awful. I mean, it's not slavery, but I mean, it's pretty awful.
Mm.
So, I don't give up on the country yet.
No, and we shouldn't. We have to, what we're doing, the work that we've been doing here since going back to I hooking up with Modjeska in 1974 is realizing that the revolution is not right around the corner, and that we have to build a movement at this point to protect ourselves and to keep the values alive and gather the power. There is no power. We have to have the power. And so that if people, I see people from this class of Modjeska School, last class of Modjeska School, and people I haven't seen in a long time signed into this. And I want them to stay in touch with us because we're going to be answering some of these hard questions about how do we get through these hard times. And Fergus, I really do appreciate you being there, and
Well,
we will continue to seek your wisdom.
now
Well, you're
there is
very kind.
there's a question or two in the chat that I want to get to before Fergus leaves us real quick.
Sure.
One is from Sharon. She asked, "Could you give some insight as to why there are still many Black people who are registered Republicans and support the Republican Party, even with the shift in their politics and identity?"
Well, okay, look, I'll tell you, I'm neither Black nor a Republican. So it's, you may have figured that out on both counts in the course of this 2 hours.
Well, let me say what a Black Republican told me one time here in South Carolina why he was a Republican. His answer was the line shorter. He could be important much more quickly.
Yes, I mean, I've known a couple of Black Republicans who I'm thinking of a woman particularly who said exactly the same thing to me up in New York. Look, we actually have two dwellings. We're living in Greensboro, North Carolina, and in Washington, D.C., which is sort of our, on our floor in Washington, D.C. is where Tim Scott lives. Tim Scott. Yes, that Tim Scott. I mean, we hear he might very recently have moved somewhere else, but I would see him in his gym stuff every day in the hall. And okay, leave Tim Scott
Well,
to himself. But my more serious answer to this question is, look, there are Black people who may believe what Republicans believe. There are, who are business, come from are business oriented, who are, I think it's imperative that if we really think democratically, that everybody deserves to have, even if it's hard, the benefit of the doubt. Well, I can think of people who don't, but never mind. But on that issue, you know, I mean, I don't feel that I or people with my set of opinions, uh, have a total monopoly on everything, on all truths. I sometimes do think that way, actually, but sincerely not. We can't, or we're not really Democrats. I'm talking about small d here, or big D either. We're not, and uh, you know. I mean, it makes no sense to me why any person, any American of any background would support our current president. It is beyond me. I can't get in those shoes. I just can't do it. But nonetheless, uh, I do think that many Black Americans, or some anyway, that I'm going to seize opportunity where it exists. And if I believe that the business of America is business, and that in the end, and you hear this on, in the ideology of the right wing, that individualism, a kind of self-made individualism, is the route to success in America and is a more honorable life. I think a person can honestly make that argument. I don't support it. I don't agree with it. I don't see it, but it's not necessarily an immoral argument. So, uh, I mean, I don't think anybody should just sort of be written off. Anybody should be written off because he doesn't share my particular set of values. And a last word on that subject. I also think we are on my side of the fence, really should not do anything to alienate our allies who may have views that are not entirely the same on some issues. We need allies, or we're going to live with the situation for a lot longer. And we need to have a really big tent here, and it doesn't mean we have to give up any beliefs that we have, but we really need to make room for other people who, sometimes you think, oh my God, how can you believe that? But, they may be allies. Anyway, so I feel very strongly about that.
No, absolutely. And our final question, because I could have had a lot to add to that as well, but I do want us to get this last question from Greg. It's a great question to end today's deeper dive. On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate the success of Reconstruction and why?
That is a killer question, Robert. That's your closer. Jeez. Okay. On a scale of 1 to 10. Well, okay, I could be evasive and say it depends on what year you want me to make that assessment. Am I making it in 1870 or 76 or 2026? I would rate it okay, I'm going to go out on a limb and rate it a 6. A 6. In other words, not a failure. It failed in certain crucial ways. I mean, the abandonment of muscular Reconstruction and the protection of African Americans in the South is one of the greatest tragedies in all of American history. The war had been won. We won the war. And the platform for kind of sane, collaborative, cooperative, biracial development was already there. The foundation was there. And we invited guys with sledgehammers in to break up that foundation. That is a crowning failure of Reconstruction. Yet, okay, slavery was ended, and an immense number, far fewer than should have been, but nonetheless, an immense number and several generations of Black Americans were empowered by what was left of that foundation. And even in the segregated South, I mean, we need to be able to be honest and say lots of Black Americans made lives, independent lives, even under the constraints and shadow of Jim Crow. And built communities, built families, built churches, built schools, colleges, and an immense number of people, not enough, got educated, learned, had mobility, never existed before, had mobility, could pick up in Mississippi and go to Chicago. And it didn't make America less racist, but it created possibility that absolutely hadn't existed. So on that score, I think lives were nonetheless, even in the constraints of Jim Crow and white supremacist law, possibilities were created which hadn't existed, and that's why I say I'm going out on a limb, but we could argue whether it's a five or a six, but that's my best. I like the question, but it's very challenging.
Oh, it really is
What's
an
your
important question.
what's your where would you put it, Robert?
Oh, we're not here for me. We're here for you. No, I think I actually would say I would say five, only because I think, like you said, we need to recognize how much changed during Reconstruction. But there is a reason why, for example, we call it the Civil Rights Movement the second Reconstruction, or as a reference to the here and now as being the third Reconstruction, the second nadir. We can keep having reconstructions, but that's indicative of how, like you said, there was a lot of work that was left on the table during that era of Reconstruction.
Yeah. I wouldn't fight you on that. I mean, I clearly, uh, it's, I just wanted to leave on a faintly positive note.
Well, that's the Modjeska school. We always leave you on a faintly positive. On that, I'm kidding. But no, I think you're right though. And I think we should all give Fergus Bordewich a round of applause for what has been a great deeper dive this afternoon. This is absolutely fantastic.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Brett, for I mean, getting me here. Well, I'm here in my house, actually. We're not in Columbia, but for making this happen. It's a pleasure. I have very fond memories, as my wife does, of our visit last year. So, be well. Take care, everybody.
Thanks so much. We really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Good night, everybody.
We'll
Bye.
be
I'm
in
going to sign
touch.
off. Great.